Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Modern Web Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Ocel. I'm a developer at this.labs. My co-host today is Jake Dohm. He's a developer at Goodwork. And today, we are very excited to talk about updates in Vue.js. And we're even more excited to have a member of the Vue.js core team and just all-around awesome person, Chris Fritz, here today to talk to us about that. So, Chris, how are you doing today?
Hi, that is part of my official intro. I request to be introduced as all-around awesome person. No, I'm
good.
kidding. That was very kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah, you didn't offer much in your rider, but that was one of them, and we were happy to oblige. So, all right. So, without much more introduction, I mean, let's get started. Maybe we'll just start with Vue 2.6, which is kind of recent. Why don't you kind of give us some updates there? Kind of like, what was that about? Like, what is in it, and kind of how does that maybe tie into some of the stuff that's coming down the road?
Great. Well, as with any release, we always have fixes and performance improvements and things like that. That's always fun. One of the biggest features that we have in Vue 2.6 is the new vSlot directive, which simplifies slots, particularly like name slots and scope slots, just to make people's lives a little bit easier. There were a lot of issues that people had, particularly with scope slots before, where it was a little bit confusing, and we're trying to alleviate some of that confusion and provide essentially like a more unified interface, like 2 slots.
Awesome.
And also out of that, like one of the things that came out of that discussion, which is also now in Vue 2.6, is dynamic directive arguments. So for example, when you want like a dynamic event name or a dynamic like attribute binding, like that is now possible within templates, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a really nice feature.
Yeah, it's one fewer situation where you might need to drop down to a render function to get, a little bit more of a dynamic template.
Yeah, we don't want to be too like those React guys and be writing render functions. So the most we can stay out of that. No, I'm totally kidding. But
yeah, no, it's not bashing React or anything. But render functions like are very useful when you want the full power of JavaScript. But yeah, people on the core team tend to prefer to write templates like 95% of the time. And one of the big reasons is there's generally only one right way to write a template. And so it's just like less you have to think about, and definitely less bike shedding about, coming up with compromises between switching back and forth between a declarative and imperative programming style, because JavaScript is mostly like an imperative programming language.
Awesome. Can you go into a little bit about, so you have Vue 2.6, and it kind of has some of these features that are backwards compatible that are going to be kind of expounded on in Vue 3. But I'm really kind of, just so people can have some confidence, when you guys release something that's like a 2.6 or 2.7 versus a 3.0, can you kind of explain a little bit more about what that means to the Vue team and kind of like some of the guarantees of whether it's safe for people to just upgrade day one, or whether they should wait, or whether they'll need a tool, or these types of things?
Yeah, great question. So what's different from a 3.0, like a major version bump, rather than minor versions like 2.6, 2.7, 2.8, is we're making breaking changes. So that means you can't count on upgrading your code or upgrading to the latest version and just having everything automatically work. There will be some updates, at least for some people, to their code in order for everything to work the same as it did. But like something that is a little bit different in the Vue team, as opposed to, just like not every software project is like this, is a lot of the people who are working on the framework are actually like using it day to day, including myself, to build real projects. And it's actually a huge pain to us personally if migrating to Vue 3 is a big problem, and will take like a week or a couple of weeks to migrate. And so migrating from Vue 1 to Vue 2, to make that easier, I wrote a migration guide of like all the things that you need to do to upgrade, including like more details on when this pattern was before possible and it'll still work, but this new pattern like is probably a better choice now, for a particular problem. And also the Vue migration helper, which for Vue 1 to Vue 2 scanned your code base and told you about the vast majority of the things that you'd need to change in order to upgrade to Vue 2. And we're doing the same kind of thing for Vue 3. Except whereas, our goal was to take like a migration that might have otherwise taken maybe a week and shorten that to about 5 hours, for a large application. For Vue 3, we want the migration helper to help you upgrade your code base in more like 5 minutes. So that will not only tell you about things that need to change, but can offer to make those changes for you automatically. In the cases where we can infer like user intent, and that's most cases.
That's really, really cool. I love the dedication you guys have to smoothing the upgrade path, because I know that's a really big thing for a lot of people, and it just helps you get users on the latest, which is great for you, great for your users, gets everybody better performance quickly and things like that.
Yeah, for us, it's ultimately selfish. Like, not only do we have, like fewer versions that we have to support, by making it easier for people to be in the latest versions. But, and by the way, we will still be supporting, Vue 2.x, for the foreseeable future. But, since we are building stuff with Vue all the time, it makes our lives easier. Like, we are the end user. So if the end user has a bad experience, we have a bad experience.
Yeah, that's awesome. So before we talk about Vue 3, there are kind of 3 versions of Vue that I'm watching right now. Vue 2, which is Vue 2.6 is the newest. Vue 3, which will be out sometime. And Vue 2 next. So can you tell us a little bit about what that is? And I guess there's a next release for each 2.0 release.
Yeah, so we're still working out exactly what the next will be, but I mean, one of the possibilities that we're thinking about now, and this should be feasible, is for Vue 3, basically having a version of Vue 3 that switches out the reactivity system, so that people can still use like all the latest features of Vue 3, except for still using a reactivity system that's more similar to what we have currently in Vue 2.x, which will make it compatible with like the same browsers that we support now, and we won't have to worry about like supporting or backporting necessarily like all the features that we would need to otherwise to 2.x. But we're still figuring that out. And either way, we want to provide like a great experience for everybody, no matter what browsers they have to support, and giving them the maximum features possible.
Yeah. Awesome. So I think we're probably ready to talk about Vue 3. So before we jump into the kind of nitty gritty, the things that have changed, I know a little bit ago, Evan was talking about how it was in private development because it was brought up. And what's kind of the reasoning there? Have you found it to be really helpful to keep it in private development? I know you guys have a public RFC process, which seems to be kind of helping out with some of the things that, some of the questions people had about keeping it in private development.
Yeah, so at github.com/Vue.js/RFCs, you can see public RFCs where we discuss things in public. And I don't know if you all have the same experience, but when you're at work and you have a meeting, do you usually invite the entire internet?
No.
Why not?
Yeah, there's a lot of opinions to handle if you do.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, you can often have a more productive discussion, especially when you're still working out things like feasibility, where, you're working out a lot of details that a very limited number of people even have the information to like contribute to that discussion. So, for these kinds of things, we find it more useful to limit discussion to the core team and, some like library authors and other people in the ecosystem and like other teams that develop like other tooling, for example, like the TypeScript team, so that we can narrow the conversation to the people who are most likely to be able to like contribute really effectively. But then before making any like final decisions on a lot of things, we open things up to a public RFC process so that we can get that feedback from the community, which is also extremely valuable. And we find that like this is a great compromise for us that helps us like be very productive and also like get feedback from all the people that we need to get feedback from, including general users.
Great.
And eventually, like once more of the feasibility questions are solved, we will be opening up the Vue 3 repo for anyone to see and comment on and get feedback on, just like Vue 2 now.
Great. Yeah. So for people that are concerned, or not concerned, but for people that just, they have an application and they have they're invested in the future of Vue just as much as any other program. They want to be able to have a seat at the table. They want to be able to see how this might impact what they're doing and give feedback about their pain points. And that's what that RFC proposal gives them. So people shouldn't feel like everything's behind closed doors, take it or leave it. Definitely people will still be involved, and that's awesome.
And people are, yeah.
Great.
People are actively taking part in those discussions and helping us make Vue better.
Yeah, and I think that happened with the 2.6 release and scope slots and the changes you made there. That went through RFC process, and I know I was reading up on all of that and seeing and thumbs upping and thumbs downing issues and things like that. Hopefully, mostly thumbs upping, but yeah, I know I was able to take part in that. I was glad to see kind of what was coming and be able to weigh in and talk about how it affected me and the apps that I write.
Yeah, that's a great example of where we actually started a lot of that discussion privately, and then once we had some of the more like feasibility or some of the bigger questions like answered, we opened up the discussion, and the feature pretty drastically changed from when we initially proposed it to what it ended up as in the end.
Awesome. So one of the interesting developments in Vue 3, and honestly, one of the more interesting developments in the last half year or year or so, is the degree to which all of this tension around typing in JavaScript suddenly exploded. And it just feels like everybody has jumped 2 feet in with TypeScript, and a lot of tools, a lot of frameworks are moving that way. Kind of curious to hear what Vue's approach using typing and TypeScript is for Vue 3, and what maybe their opinion is about what people should do on their own projects. Like, if Vue embraces TypeScript, does that mean that they're saying that people should be embracing TypeScript on their projects? Will it work without it? And things like that for people that are concerned.
Yeah, great question. Well, first I want to say that Vue 3 being written in TypeScript actually doesn't really affect users at all, whether they're writing TypeScript or not. So like for Vue 2 in our code base for a long time, we've been using Flow for typings. And that's probably something that most people didn't know about because they've never had to know about it. It doesn't affect them. So it's really just for our development process. I personally find TypeScript and typings in general to be very useful in libraries. Like when you have a well-defined problem, like the typings can make it easier to contribute and easier to maintain. So I really like TypeScript for libraries. For applications, there are more trade-offs, I find. So for example, for people who don't have a lot of experience with a strongly typed language like C# or JavaScript or Java, for example, then what I've seen is people often struggle a lot to make the type system happy. And a lot of the patterns that they're used to being able to use, these very dynamic patterns that are very common in JavaScript, aren't as good a fit in TypeScript because they're very hard to type in many cases, and can cause a lot of extra work or force people to use a slightly different pattern that works better with TypeScript.
Great.
And I've personally found it more useful to, in many applications, at least for these teams who aren't used to these languages, to spend that time like writing unit tests rather than fighting with the type system.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Because the vast majority of bugs like that I experience in applications are not type bugs. And when you have like quickly changing expectations, when you have quickly changing specifications requirements, like you do in many projects, which is typically very different from libraries, then sometimes those more dynamic patterns like can be really useful.
Great. And so the general gist of this is that just because Vue is embracing TypeScript, I mean, that's kind of something that is useful for contributors to the project. It obviously will integrate really well with IDEs. But if people are currently using Flow for their current project, if they're using TypeScript, they're using nothing, realistically, this change shouldn't affect their decision of whether to upgrade, or it won't cause them any pressures or issues with their upgrade to Vue 3.
No, really, the biggest difference for us is like right now we maintain like separate typings for TypeScript, which is not only used for people who use TypeScript, but also for tooling like in VS Code, so that you can get, whether you're using TypeScript or regular JavaScript, you can still get really nice like auto completion, and you can get some extra information about the interface within the editor. And writing it in TypeScript just means that we don't have to maintain those manually anymore. So that's easier.
That's awesome. Well, great. Well, so other things, like as far as like the features of kind of where the Vue community is going, the features they've asked you guys about and that are starting to be incorporated into Vue 3, like I'm sure you have your own. Two that jumped out to me, the concept of portals and fragments are really cool. I like that a lot. I don't know if you want to speak maybe at a high level, and then maybe you can pull it into Vue 3, just kind of like where you've seen the Vue community and the kind of the issues that they're dealing with and some of the things that you guys are addressing with Vue 3.
Yeah, I mean, I guess first of all, in terms of fragments, like the big thing to note is that we will not have the restriction that we have in Vue 2, where for components you need to have a single root node, which means in some cases where you need to return, where you want to return like a list of elements, you find yourself having to like wrap them in a div or something like that, which is annoying. And like in the React world, that problem is solved by fragments. But really, I feel like the ideal solution would be not having like any special feature for that, having it just work. So when you like have more than one root node and a template, that just compiles to like an array of elements. And you can just like return an array of nodes when you're writing a render function. Because we already have an abstraction for a list of things, like an ordered list of things. And so I don't feel like we need to invent a new one. Yeah, so that's why I kind of veer away talking about like fragment specifically, because I don't think we need a new feature for that. I think we can just make it work.
Yeah, I agree. But I think like one of the things that's great about it is one of the knocks, especially recently, is just this concept of like the div soup, like the gigantic list of unnecessary and non-semantic tags that are just created because various frameworks might require that base root element. And I just like that idea, as I do in other frameworks as well, that people don't have to feel constrained to an arbitrary, they don't have to change their syntax or their HTML just to suit sort of an arbitrary constraint.
Yeah, in general, like what we try to do in Vue, and especially with Vue 3, where we have an opportunity to make breaking changes, is we want to limit the number of things that developers have to think about, and limit the cases where like you have to solve a problem rather than the framework solving it for you just automatically, and then you can just focus on the problems that are specific to your application. And so we're continuing to try to do that. And that example of like removing that limitation is one example of that. There are some other things that we're trying to do. So for like transparent wrapper components, which is basically like whenever you have some kind of like base input component, like wherever you're going to have an input, you want to use this component because it has like special styles on it and maybe some special behavior. So it's like a super powered input element, and whenever you have inputs, you're going to use this. Making these components work exactly like the element, in terms of it accepting all the same attributes and all the same listeners as a normal input element, takes a little bit of ceremony right now in Vue 2. So that it might be like 30 lines just for the boilerplate of like getting all that working. And we hope to limit that down to basically one line in Vue 3, which is pretty cool. And also removing some of the things that are more implicit, so that, again, because anything implicit is something that you have to kind of keep in your head, and moving towards more and more explicitness. So for example, there's a .native modifier currently in Vue 2. And the problem with using the .native modifier is it listens for a native event rather than like one of our custom events on the root element of whatever like component you're listening to. And that assumes a couple things. First, that there is a single root element, which even for Vue 2, like that's not true for every component. So for functional components that use a render function, they can actually return an array of nodes instead of a single one. And it also assumes that like that root element won't change significantly. So let's go back to our input example. If we're using .native on a parent component to listen for like a change event on the input or a blur event, whatever, and then we decide to refactor our input element or input component to wrap it in a label. So now the label is the root element. And if you try to listen for a change or a blur event, like none of this is going to work anymore. But there's no indication inside of that like base input component that something like is relying on a very specific root element for this component. And so, we have new patterns planned. I'll be talking about some of these and showing them off a little bit at VueConf US coming up very soon, which will be pretty exciting. And yeah, just like making things simpler for developers, and like reducing the number of concepts that they have to learn and keep in their head. Yeah, and just making it easier to do your job. That's what we want to do.
Yeah, that's really awesome. That's one of the things that drew me to Vue too, coming from an HTML, CSS background and not knowing as much JavaScript. I really, with Vue's template syntax and the way that their directives and listeners work, it was the concepts were close enough for me that as a fairly junior and new developer, I could kind of pick up Vue. And so I really love hearing about reducing these things, making it so, like with that .native event, something that is a little hard to test for, probably a little harder to, there's a little bit more magic there in how that works. And sometimes that can be good to abstract away some of that pain. But I love hearing about how you guys are focusing on how easy it is to pick up, how easy it is for a new developer or whoever to jump into a code base and understand what's happening. So that's really awesome.
Yeah, so we're trying to find ways, and so far I think we're being pretty successful in finding ways to like limit the number of things that you have to think about, and also like just making the code simpler. So like we're not just removing features, we're making things work for you automatically whenever we can, and also making it easier to implement those features. Implement that same behavior and solve the same kind of problem than it was even before.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's really awesome. One thing that piqued my interest when I was looking through the new things coming to Vue 3 was classes and how that's going to impact how people generally write their components. The main question that kind of came to my mind is that going to be sort of the new standard, or is that a new avenue to write components, but maybe equal or just a complement to the current template syntax? So I'd love to, or the current, you do like Vue.component, or you load them in from a single file component with Vue load or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic question. So in the docs, the default syntax that you're going to see will still be the object-based syntax. That's not going to change. But we do offer the classes for people who prefer that kind of interface. And classes have a few advantages in terms of TypeScript, where it'll be easier to type a lot of the things in your components using the class-based interface rather than using the object-based, like options object, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
An improvement to our docs that we're planning. Sorry, 1 second.
Nope.
An improvement to our docs that we're planning is we want all of the examples to be configurable so that you can switch back and forth between the different environments that you want, where you can choose. I want to see the options syntax, the options-based syntax, or the object-based syntax versus the class-based syntax. Or I want to see a TypeScript environment, or I want to see an environment with like modern JS, for example, compiled with JavaScript, or I want to see plain ES5 examples. And the plain ES5 with the object-based syntax, that will work in like every supported browser, is still going to be the default, so that we have that really gentle learning curve. And for the people who are using a more advanced environment, it'll be as simple as like flipping a switch on the page, and then we'll remember your choice.
That's really awesome. That sounds really incredible. I can't wait to see that. Because, a lot of times you get linked to an example and it might be exactly what you're looking for, but it's not quite in a format that or you're like, hey, yeah, I'm trying to do this, but I'm trying to do it with my code base, which is done this way, or it's typed, or it's not typed, or it's ES5 and you don't have Babel running, and so it's more overhead to try to figure out how to turn the object that returns a function to the shorthand ES6 syntax for that. I know a lot of people have ran into that, so I'm excited to see that kind of made even easier for people.
Yeah, so we'll be using the same tooling for that we're developing for the migration helper.
Cool.
So we'll be able to do all sorts of things. Yeah. So wow. It'll not only be able to write your code for you in many cases, but we'll get these dynamic examples, and there are probably even more uses for it that we haven't even imagined yet.
So I have a question about classes, and it is, how does it change, if at all, the relationship to things like mixins and directives and plugins? Is there any difference in the way that, if people are maintaining their own private set of those types of objects, does that change at all when they have to start considering interfacing with class-based things, or will the proposal for classes sort of weave those in basically the same way as the object syntax?
No, in some cases there will be some changes in the way that you'll develop some of these features. For example, I want to make it clear that a lot of this is still in very active development and evolving, and there's a lot of discussion every single day about this syntax, so it is subject to and will continue to evolve. But like the way that like methods, for example, will likely be implemented in the class-based syntax is they will just be methods on the class, rather than having like a special method section, inside of an object. And the way that computed properties will be implemented will probably just be getters. So you'll say get the name of your computed property, and then you'll define the function for that getter. And similarly, like for data, we're thinking about allowing you to just define like a property on the class and having that be data. And that also makes it easier to type for TypeScript. And similarly for some options, they can be static properties. Mm-hmm. And cool. some of these features of classes are still evolving and finalizing in the spec. So a big part of how they will eventually evolve in terms of what we implement for Vue is how the spec itself continues to develop, and how like browser support continues to develop, and how implementations of these features within Babel and TypeScript continues to evolve. So we're balancing all of these things. We don't want to rely on features that are unstable mm-hmm. for you to just like use basic Vue features. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And so like because like Vuex is one of the big libraries, right? That you guys maintain, but there might be people that are maintaining their own private versions of smaller versions of things like that, where they're they're doing these mix-ins, they're doing these plugins. To your understanding, obviously it's in active development, but like, will people need to be aware of whether their users or their third-party libraries are using class-based components versus object-based components? Like after it compiles down, it should just sort of be all the same, right? It just depends on what you're using, or is that not accurate? I guess I'm just trying to understand for people how they need to know, not necessarily how class-based syntax will change the components they control, but maybe how aware they'll have to be about whether some library they pull in that gives them some off-the-shelf components, whether they're using that syntax or not.
Yeah, obviously, we want to limit the number of cases where library authors like have to consider more variables. Like that's part of, just like reducing the number of things that people have to think about. But there may be some cases where we just can't get around that. We'll see.
Okay,
cool,
great.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. One thing that we haven't talked about that I'm extremely excited about in Vue 3, and that I mentioned earlier when talking about the upgrade path, is performance. And I saw a pretty bold claim on one of these websites about Vue 3. I think it was Evan's article. He said 100% performance increase across the board, which seems really, really awesome. A faster startup, a lighter bundle. So do you want to talk about maybe a little bit of how that was done? Maybe not too deeply, but how that's done, how that's going to affect users.
Let's see. Yeah, I don't know if I could talk not deeply about how it's done. And honestly, some of it, I had, I just haven't even looked at how it's done because I was not involved in it at all and haven't there hasn't been any need to like document or discuss any part of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, generally speaking, twice as fast, half as big. So Vue 3 is generally a Daft Punk song, harder, better, faster, stronger, except to replace harder with easier.
I love it. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited for people to start seeing those performance gains in their apps when Vue 3 comes out. It'll be a game changer in a lot of ways, just to reduce people's boot up time, get time to interactive to much faster.
Yeah.
One of the things I was really excited about was with the reactivity system, lazy evaluation with proxies, or lazy observation with proxies, where not all of your data will be observed on initial boot up, but only the data that you're using in your initial view or whatever you render initially. And that's one kind of, I think, performance win, and something I was really interesting with, and how the new proxy system for reactivity is going to work.
Yeah, proxies open up a lot of opportunities for wins like that.
Yeah, that's really neat. And I guess so part of the performance gains in Vue 3 will be related to being able to modernize parts of the code base. And like with proxies will be the default reactivity system. But for 3, we'll also be working in IE 11 and browsers like that, which don't support proxies. So I guess some of those performance wins will be opt-in, or you'll get in newer browsers where they're available, but you guys are still supporting IE 11 and different feature sets for different browsers.
Exactly.
Yeah. So for that, with the proxy reactivity system, will that be something that you kind of pick your version of Vue? You pick the Vue 3, or you pick the Vue 3, I don't know what it's going to be called, but whatever version works with more legacy browsers. Will you be able to do something that we've talked about before on the podcast, where you do like the no module and serve the newer version to newer browsers and the older version of Vue to older browsers? Or is that kind of opt-in for your application?
Yeah, there's definitely opportunity to do something like that, where you can serve the newer version to newer browsers and the older version to older browsers. But there will still be some things that you'll have to do in your code to cover the caveats of the reactivity system, because you won't be able to rely on your users like using the newer reactivity system. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you'll still have to build your code as if all of your users are using the old reactivity system, if you want to support those older browsers.
Got it. Because the new reactivity system removes a few of the gotchas that were in the old one with setting.
Removes all of the gotchas.
Okay. So just 100% works.
100% just works. Yeah.
That's really awesome. Because
that's one of the reasons we're so excited about it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really neat. So you'll still be able to get the performance wins with the new reactivity system, but not the kind of stability if you're using the older version of Vue 3, or the what are you guys calling that? Is there a name for that yet?
The Vue 3 with a different reactivity system. I guess that's what I'm usually calling it, but we'll probably have like a better name for it eventually.
Cool. Need a cool name for it. Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions?
No, I don't. I'll get back to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, maybe we'll call it the compat build or something like that. Compatibility build.
Yeah, that's cool enough.
It's not really cool. It's descriptive, but
yeah. We'll work on it. We'll workshop it.
We'll call it the Xenon build. That sounds cool, right?
It does.
Okay. Well, I'd love to pivot out of the specifics about Vue 3 and maybe into the general, sort of, as we kind of come to the back half or the back part of this podcast. And one of the things that I've always loved about Vue, and why I've always suggested it, is sort of highlighted by this report I saw by Monorail, which I thought was really cool. Basically said that of the people they surveyed, 92% of the people would use Vue again. Chris, you'd love to hear this, that 94% of the people that they surveyed used the official documentation. So that's a huge win. And 58% of the people said they used it due to its ease of adoption, right? And one of the things that I love a lot about Vue is the Vue CLI. And one of the best parts of the Vue CLI that I actually just recently found out was actually released is the GUI. And I just think that this is phenomenal as far as reducing the friction for not only people to get into using Vue, but people just to do web development, period. Right? Yeah. Like it's not crazy that we require command line competence in web development, but it doesn't have to be a thing that is required for people to get into doing things to the degree to which it is now. And so, I just think in general, the thesis and the question here is, it must be intentional, that this is part of Vue's strategy to really, be there for people and to be easy to adopt and to kind of reduce that friction. Is that an intentional part of the strategy? And what other elements of that strategy, as far as Vue continues to grow its community, what kind of things are you guys pursuing?
Absolutely. I mean, we our primary mission is to increase developer happiness, because that's what leads to great apps, and that's what leads to people wanting to come to work tomorrow, which means they're not going to jump ship and work somewhere else. And they're going to be motivated to come up with beautiful applications and clever solutions. And this is definitely part of that, making developers happier. Whenever you have, some kind of command line interface that you have to memorize, you're basically keeping all of that in your head instead of being able to see what's on there. It's sort of if you were building a website, forcing the user to memorize all of the different kinds of buttons and then just type in keywords, for login. It's oh, login didn't work. Maybe I'll try sign in. That would be a terrible experience, but that's often the experience of working on the command line. And also in working in configuration files. So let's say, for example, you're using ESLint in your project, and you are looking at enabling rules, or you're looking at some of the rules that are currently there and thinking about whether you want to keep them. But the thing is, just looking at the rules, you're not necessarily sure what they do, and you're not sure what options they take, and you're not sure where you can find out more about them. And so this is an example where, again, in the Vue CLI UI, we try to help out. And this is the UI was built by Guillaume Chow, and he came up with the idea as well on the core team. Beautiful, amazing. The first time he showed me some initial screenshots, I was blown away. It seems so obvious once you see it, but before you see it, we take for granted that this is just how life has to be. So in an ESLint configuration file, you can get a list of all of the rules that you can add that are specific to Vue, including descriptions of what the rules do. And you can have select boxes and things like that. So you can choose to turn them on and turn them on with different kinds of settings. So all of this makes your life a lot easier. It tells you the information that you're missing right away, rather than you having to memorize the entire interface or keep looking it up. And when you do want to see more information and more examples, there are links directly to the documentation for each specific rule that you can go and click on and find out more immediately.
Yeah, it really is powerful. And not to be specific about the tool, but just to give a sense, even if you've never used Vue one day in your life, if you're a React developer, Angular developer, whatever framework or whatever approach you take, just fire it up. Because you'll be amazed the inspiration it might give you, especially if you're a person that likes building libraries and tools for whatever framework you use it, play with it, see it. I mean, the ability that it has to run your builds and to show you the status of your builds and to launch your server and to open your browser to the server so you don't have to understand ports even and how to read the port out of all the things that puke out. The idea that eventually that could pull in things like your Webpack bundle explorer or visualizations and I don't know what I don't even know what you guys probably have crazier ideas than we can think of, but super awesome. And I just think that is so great for the community.
Yeah, I agree. And something else built into Vue CLI that we talked about a little bit earlier. Jake, you were talking about having separate builds for using the latest reactivity system for Vue 3 and also supporting the other browsers with a dumber reactivity system. So in Vue CLI already for Vue 2, we have a build mode called Modern Mode. And in Modern Mode, we actually produce two different bundles. The Modern bundle that is served to all of the all of the evergreen browsers that support so many modern features, and also the legacy bundle, which is basically served to Internet Explorer. So that way, like, you're not in a situation where you have to bundle all of these polyfills and all of these implementations of native features that Babel or TypeScript gives you, just in case you need to actually just in case the browser doesn't support those features natively. You can instead deliver a slimmer bundle to those modern browsers that will also run faster, because you can use these native implementations of features that can be better optimized by the browsers instead of these implementations that have to be built into the code and shipped with it, that the browser can't optimize for as well.
Awesome. And sort of, at Modern Web, we love talking about communities. We love talking about, the ways that are, that we are just a community of developers around the world and just tackling the problems that we have. So one of the things that has always struck me is about Vue, and I love this, and I don't know if you want to speak to it at all or just sort of highlight it, is that if you go to the list of core team members on the Vue.js website, you will see almost, it seems like, every single language from around the world, just a wide array and diversity of voices and different people that are involved in this project and communities. And I think that net expands even more widely if you start talking about things like the Vue CLI and the Vuex and all the other sort of closely tied things. So I don't know if you want to say anything about what that does for Vue as a framework, as a community, to just have such great international support and adoption of the library and just such a wide variety of people involved.
Yeah, so we have, last I counted, which was a while ago, so I'm sure this is out of date, but last I checked, we had core team members in 12 different countries across 9 different time zones. So we are truly the team that never sleeps, and is also never fully awake. So that there are 2 sides of that. We're always a little bit drowsy. Yeah, that is really exciting. I mean, we get not only a ton of different perspectives, culturally, but we really get to work on things all over the place, and we get to draw from so many different communities, which, yeah, I just find very useful. I can't remember, I think it was Alan Kay, who the computer scientist, who said that a change in perspective is worth 80 IQ points. And I think that's really true. Just having a new perspective in the conversation can give you way more than just having a genius in the conversation.
Awesome. Well, that's awesome. And I think that's a really great place for us to stop there. That's a really great note to end on. So that's it for today, everybody. Thank you so much. Really wish this could have gone on for hours, but thanks for listening to the Modern Web Podcast. And thank you, Chris, for joining us to talk about Vue. As always, the conversation doesn't have to stop here. You can find Chris on Twitter at Chris V Fritz. So that's ChrisVFritz. And I think you can also find him in 2 weeks in Tampa at VueConf US. So if you don't already have your tickets, or if you can't make it, I'm pretty sure probably stuff will be online. So you can definitely hear about all the latest updates and even more cool stuff that you can do with Vue just coming up in a couple weeks. So you don't have to wait super long. Also want to thank my co-host, Jake. You can find him online at Jake Dohm. That's JakeDohm. And you can find me online at Robocell. That's ROBOCELL. You can also find us online at moderndotweb.com or on Twitter at modern.web. And so that's it for today, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.